There are renewed calls for the African continent to focus on security as well as political and economic decolonization strategies. This comes in the wake of high-level visits to Africa by the foreign ministers of Russia and the US. And currently, the French President Emmanuel Macron is in Algeria. For more on this or these strategies that Africa should adopt, we're joined by Professor Adekeye Adebajo from the University of Pretoria Center for the Advancement of Scholarship. Prof, thank you very much for availing yourself this afternoon. So maybe for the purpose of this discussion, if we focus on the G5, Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad as well, what is it that keeps fueling instability there? If you go online, one would be forgiven for thinking that it's purely climate change, as many experts have pointed out that climate change is fueling the conflict.
Well, I think it's quite complicated and deep-rooted problems, going all the way back, for example, in the case of Mali, to the Tuareg issue from the 1960s, when a particular group felt excluded and aggrieved and started an insurrection which continued for several decades. And even though there was some kind of peace agreement by the early 1990s, this did not hold. And another issue I think that's been important is the NATO intervention, the regime change intervention in Libya in 2011 led to an increase this instability, because a lot of the militants that Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan leader, had armed, basically then flowed into Mali and Burkina Faso and the rest of the Sahel as well. And of course, there are governance issues in a lot of these countries in the Sahel that you've just mentioned. So I think it's a combination and a cocktail of those phenomena.
Then in comes a number of stakeholders. So you've got heavy multinational military footprint on the continent, including France, right? With the president reiterating his support for the continent, West Africa in particular. How should we then understand their intervention, especially because it's yielded very little results?
Well, I think France, and I've consistently written and spoken out about the French presence in Africa. France has intervened over 50 times in post-independence Africa, and it's often to depose or support different sorts of autocrats in countries as varied as Togo, Zaire, now the DRC, in Congo-Brazzaville, in Gabon. And I think the French role basically has been very negative and very debilitating and destabilizing as far as Africa is concerned. And this still continues because France isn't exactly supporting democratic governance. If we look at a situation like Chad, for example, where Idriss Deby, the long-ruling autocrat, died, his son took over a military leader, which was effectively a coup d'etat, and France supported it while trying to condemn a military coup in Mali. So it acts inconsistently, and it has tried to wage a counterinsurgency campaign through the G5 countries that you've mentioned, but this counterinsurgency campaign has not been particularly well funded and not been particularly well led and prosecuted. It's led to a lot of deaths, and the cannon fodder that have been used in these campaigns have been the armies of Mali and also places like Burkina Faso, Chad, and others. So it's not been a very successful French intervention.
Prof, in your article, you argue that Africa need not be, for the very near future anyway, a perpetual victim, right? So you speak of Africa needing to promote economic decolonization. What does that mean?
Well, the economic decolonization just basically means that Africa has to work with allies in the global south, countries like China, Brazil, India, Indonesia, to increase its leverage and influence in Western-dominated institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. And it has to also, on its own, make sure there is national cohesiveness and unity. We build strong internal economies. We try to industrialize rather than just digging out goods from the ground and exporting them. And we try to make sure that we have 5 strong sub-regional pillars like ECOWAS and SADC and ICAT in each sub-region, so that regional trade, which is currently a measly 16%, can be increased, and Africa can start generating some of its own resources. And through that sort of economic development and integration, we can then have more capacity to be able to provide more security for the continent as well.
All the solutions seem to be very obvious, but the will, you do wonder whether it is there. Thank you very much. That's all the time we can afford for today, at least. And that was Professor Adebajo Adekeye.